What if everything you believed about your past was a lie? Imagine waking up one day and discovering that your entire identity, your family, your history, the foundation of who you are, was built on a secret so carefully buried that it was never meant to be uncovered. This isn't just a story about love or betrayal. It's about the weight of choices, the pain of silence, and the undeniable power of truth. For 50 years, one man lived believing he knew his wife. He built a life with her, stood by her side through wealth, struggle, and time. But on her deathbed, she whispered something that would shatter his reality forever. What she confessed wasn't just heartbreaking, it was unforgivable. Now, he's left with a choice: bury the past or uncover a truth that could change lives forever. But the real question is, some truths are too heavy to carry. So is it better to never know? Stay with me, because this story will challenge everything you think about love, loyalty, and the secrets we take to the grave. The rain had started just after midnight, a soft pattering against the grand windows of the Whitmore Carter estate. The house, once full of life and echoes of laughter, had grown eerily silent. Only the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall seemed to remind the world that time had not stopped. Henry Carter sat beside the large canopy bed, his dark, calloused hand gently holding the frail, almost translucent fingers of his wife. Eleanor Whitmore Carter, once the embodiment of Southern grace and privilege, now lay motionless beneath layers of embroidered sheets, her once vibrant blue eyes dulled by the weight of illness. The room smelled of aged wood and lavender oil, the same scent Eleanor had always worn, though now it clung more to the pillows than to her skin. Henry studied her face, the sharp cheekbones softened by time, the delicate lines tracing stories of decades spent together. But there was something in her expression that unsettled him, something beyond pain. A deep breath rattled in Eleanor's chest, her lips parting as if summoning strength from the dimly lit chandelier above them. "Henry," she whispered, voice barely audible over the rain tapping at the window pane. He leaned in closer, gripping her fingers just a little tighter, afraid to let go, afraid that if he blinked, she would disappear. "I'm here," he murmured, voice steady despite the storm inside him. She swallowed, her throat working against the weakness in her body. "I have to tell you something." Henry forced a small smile. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just rest." "No," she insisted, her grip tightening ever so slightly. "Not before it's too late." Henry straightened. He had never heard that tone in her voice before, not desperation, not fear, but something heavier, a confession waiting to break free. For 50 years, they had shared everything, or so he had believed. They had built a life together, endured whispers and sideways, glances for daring to love in a world that had not always accepted them. Henry had fought for their place, carved out a legacy, and yet here she was, on the edge of forever, trembling with a secret. Eleanor inhaled shakily, eyes searching his face. "There's something I never told you," she admitted, and in that moment, Henry felt the air in the room shift, the weight of unseen ghosts pressing in. She coughed, a weak, dry sound, and he instinctively reached for the glass of water beside the bed, helping her sip. The act was second nature now, caring for her, protecting her. But how did one protect someone from their own past? "I should have told you a long time ago," she continued, her voice breaking, "but I was afraid." A strange tightness formed in Henry's chest. He had known this woman for most of his life, memorized every laugh, every tear, every flicker of emotion in her eyes. But what he saw now was unfamiliar. Guilt, raw and aching. "Eleanor, whatever it is, just say it," he urged, his thumb brushing against her knuckles in a silent promise. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if bracing herself for the weight of the truth. When she opened them again, tears clung to her lashes. "Before you, before us," she hesitated, staring past him, as if looking through time itself. "I was in love with someone else." The words should have hurt, but Henry felt no jealousy, only confusion. She had been young before they met, and love before marriage was no crime. But there was something in the way she said it, as if this love had not simply been a chapter, but an entire life buried beneath the years. He waited, sensing there was more. "I was young, reckless," she continued, her fingers trembling in his. "And he worked for my family." A strange, cold sensation prickled at the back of Henry's neck. "His name was Isaiah," she said, barely above a whisper. He was like you, kind, strong, and we had a child together." Silence. The rain outside seemed to stop. The clock in the hall ticked slower. The walls of the grand bedroom, filled with a lifetime of shared memories, suddenly felt foreign. Henry blinked. "What?" She inhaled shakily. "My father found out. He took the baby from me. I never saw him again." A sob cracked her voice. "I let them take him, Henry. I was too scared to fight. A child, not his." Henry pulled back slightly, his heart slamming against his ribs. He had spent his life loving this woman, believing that he had given her everything. But now he was realizing there was a part of her, of them, that had never truly belonged to him. His voice was low when he finally spoke. "Where is he?" Eleanor's lips quivered. "I don't know," she admitted, tears trailing down her temples. "My father arranged it all. I was sent away, and when I returned, he was gone. I asked, but they never told me." Henry stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His breath came short, his chest rising and falling. Too fast. He turned toward the window, staring out at the storm, trying to anchor himself in something, anything. Eleanor had always been his home. The woman he had built a life with, defended against those who doubted them, loved beyond reason. But now, there was a crack in the foundation, and through it something painful and unknown seeped in. He closed his eyes. A child, a son, lost to time. He turned back to Eleanor, who lay there, fragile and broken in ways he had never seen before. Her face was etched with years of regret, of a story she had tried to forget but could never truly bury. "I wanted to tell you," she whispered. "But how do you say something like this?" Henry exhaled, running a hand over his face. He didn't know. He didn't know what to feel: anger, sadness, betrayal, but above all, there was a question he couldn't shake. Was his son still out there? And if he was, would he ever forgive the mother who had let him go? The summer of 1971 was suffocating, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made the air feel heavy with something unspoken. The Whitmore estate stood tall and proud, its white columns gleaming under the southern sun, a symbol of wealth, tradition, and power. Inside its iron gates, life moved in carefully orchestrated steps, maids in crisp uniforms, gardeners tending the endless rose bushes, and stable hands keeping the prized horses ready for the next gala. And in the midst of it all was Eleanor Whitmore, a 22-year-old woman with golden hair and sapphire blue eyes, who, despite her privilege, felt more like a prisoner than a daughter in her father's grand house. She was expected to be perfect, to smile at the right people, to dance at the right parties, and eventually to marry the right man. But Eleanor had never been good at following rules, and nothing proved that more than Isaiah Walker. Isaiah was a stable hand, a man with strong arms, deep brown skin, and eyes so dark They swallowed the light. He was quiet, but not weak. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, a sense of knowing exactly who he was in a world that tried to make men like him feel small. And Eleanor had noticed him from the moment she was old enough to understand what desire was. It started in stolen glances, a second too long when she passed the stables. A heartbeat skipped when their hands brushed as he helped her onto her horse. Then whispers in the night, hidden between the trees at the edge of the estate, where no one dared to look. And finally, love. A love that made no sense in a world that would never allow it. A love that forced them into secrecy, where passion burned between shadows and laughter had to be silenced before it reached the wrong ears. "Come away with me," Isaiah had whispered one night, his fingers tangled in her golden curls, his breath warm against her ear. "Let's leave all of this behind." Eleanor wanted to say yes. She wanted to run, to escape, the weight of her last name, to build a world where no one could tell them they didn't belong together. But reality was cruel. Her father's power stretched further than just the estate. He had connections, money, and influence that could crush Isaiah with a single word, and Eleanor knew that loving him was dangerous, not just for her, but for him. So she hesitated. And then, the unthinkable happened. She was late. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor's body betrayed her, confirming what she already feared. She was carrying Isaiah's child. The realization hit her like a wave, both thrilling and terrifying. She had never felt more alive than when she was with him, but now life had taken root inside her, a life that would shatter everything. She told Isaiah beneath the old magnolia tree, their secret meeting place. His face, usually so calm, cracked with emotion. He placed his hand gently over her stomach, and for a moment, there was only wonder in his eyes. "We'll find a way," he promised. "I'll take care of you both." And she believed him. For one beautiful, fleeting moment, she let herself dream of a life where love was enough, where they could leave the Whitmore name behind and raise their child in a place where no one cared about their differences. But Eleanor had underestimated her father. One evening, just as the sun was bleeding into the horizon, she was called into his study. The air inside was suffocating, thick with cigar smoke and the scent of aged bourbon. Gerald Whitmore sat behind his massive oak desk, his expression unreadable. "You've been reckless," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "and now you will pay the price." Her heart pounded. "Father, please." He stood, towering over her like a shadow of inevitability. "Do you think I would let my daughter bring disgrace to this family? Do you think that boy will get away with what he's done?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Don't hurt him," she pleaded. Her father's eyes were like steel. "You will leave. You will have this child in secret, and when you return, it will be as if it never existed." Terror gripped her. "No! There is no no in this house," he snapped, his voice like the crack of a whip. "You will do as you're told, or I will make sure Isaiah Walker disappears from this earth." Her blood turned to ice. She had no choice. That night she ran to the stables, breathless, heart pounding against her ribs. Isaiah was there, waiting, always, waiting for her. She threw herself into his arms, but before she could speak, before she could warn him, two men emerged from the darkness, her father's men. The next moments were a blur. Isaiah's shouts, fists flying, Eleanor screaming, her body wrenched away from his as he was dragged into the night. "No!" she sobbed, fighting against the iron grip of the men holding her back. Isaiah's voice echoed through the air. "Eleanor!" And then he was gone. She never saw him again. 2 days later, she was put on a train, sent away to a home for unwed mothers under a false name. She gave birth in a cold, sterile room, her cries of pain swallowed by the white walls that offered no comfort. A nurse placed the baby in her arms. A boy, tiny and perfect, his skin a warm shade of brown, his dark eyes so much like his father's. She sobbed as she traced his little fingers, as she whispered promises she knew she could never keep. And then, before she could memorize every detail, before she could carve his face into her soul, they took him. She screamed, she begged, but in the end, she was just a daughter obeying her father's will. When she returned to the Whitmore estate, the world acted as if nothing had happened. Her father never spoke of it again, the staff never met her eyes, and Eleanor, once so full of defiance, was now hollow. Her son was gone, Isaiah was gone, and for the rest of her life, she carried the weight of their ghosts. The heavy scent of cigar smoke clung to the air like an omen. The study, lined with towering bookshelves and rich mahogany furniture, felt colder than usual despite the summer heat pressing against the grand windows. The flickering glow of a single desk lamp cast deep shadows on the walls, stretching the silhouette of Gerald Whitmore as he sat behind his massive oak desk, his hands steepled in front of him. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She had been summoned, not asked, not invited, but commanded to appear before her father. That alone told her this was no ordinary conversation. Her mother, Margaret Whitmore, sat stiffly in an armchair by the fireplace, her porcelain features unreadable, hands folded neatly in her lap. She had not spoken a word since Eleanor entered the room. That silence unsettled her more than anything. The weight of her father's stare bore down on her. "Sit." Eleanor hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her pale blue dress, but she lifted her chin and crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps. She would not let him see her fear. She sat. Her father exhaled, the end of his cigar burning in the dim light. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The question landed like a slap. She clenched her fists in her lap. Gerald leaned forward. "You have embarrassed this family." Her breath hitched. "I haven't done anything wrong." His jaw tightened. "You think lying with a stable hand, letting some low-born man put his hands on you is nothing wrong?" His voice was eerily calm, which made it all the more terrifying. Eleanor swallowed hard, but she didn't look away. "I love him." A slow, bitter laugh rumbled from his chest. "Love," he scoffed. "Do you think love will protect you when the world looks at your bastard child and sees nothing but a mistake?" Eleanor's whole body stiffened. She had imagined this confrontation, but hearing the words out loud was like a dagger twisting in her ribs. Her father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. He paced behind his desk, his hands clasped behind his back. "You were born into this family, into this legacy. The Whitmore name carries power, respect. You were meant to marry well, to strengthen our ties with the kind of men who matter." Her voice cracked. "Is that all I was to you? A pawn in one of your political games?" Gerald stopped, his gaze burning into hers. "You were supposed to understand the weight of your own name." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "And what about me? About what I want, what I feel?" Her mother shifted in her chair, finally speaking, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Eleanor, sometimes what we want is not what is best for us." Eleanor turned to her sharply. "Best for me, or best for you?" Margaret's expression remained composed, but there was something flickering beneath the surface, an unease, an old wound reopened. Gerald exhaled, shaking his head. "I've already made arrangements. You leave tomorrow morning. The staff has been told you're visiting an aunt. You'll stay at a private home in Charleston until the child is born." The words hit her like a blow. "No," she whispered. Gerald's eyes darkened. "You don't have a choice." She shot to her feet, her pulse roaring in her ears. "You can't do this!" He slammed his fist against the desk, rattling the lamp. "I will do whatever is necessary to protect this family's reputation." Tears burned at the edges of her vision. And what about Isaiah? A slow, deliberate smirk curled at the corner of his mouth. He won't be a problem anymore. Ice spread through Eleanor's veins. "What do you mean?" she demanded, but her voice was barely a breath. Her father's silence was suffocating. "No," she whispered, panic tightening in her chest. "What did you do?" She turned to her mother, but Margaret only lowered her gaze, refusing to meet her daughter's eyes. Eleanor bolted for the door. She ran barefoot down the grand staircase, nearly colliding with a maid who gasped at the sight of her. The world outside was drowning in moonlight as she rushed across the manicured lawns, her dress billowing behind her. The stables. She had to find him. She reached the barn, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might shatter. "Isaiah!" she called, breathless, desperate. Silence. Then from the shadows, the stable manager, Mr. Hargrove, stepped forward. He removed his hat, his face grim. "Miss Eleanor," he said softly. She shook her head. "Where is he?" Hargrove hesitated. "Where is he?" she screamed. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Gone." The world tilted beneath her feet. "Gone?" Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. "He was dismissed, Miss Eleanor. Your father—" He stopped himself. "He didn't want no trouble." "No, no, no, no." She backed away, shaking her head. "Tell me he's alive." Hargrove's face twisted with something that looked like pity. "I don't know, miss." The night swallowed the rest of her breath. She turned, ran back toward the house, toward the towering facade of the Whitmore estate, toward the man who had destroyed everything. Her father was waiting for her in the foyer, his expression unreadable. "You will forget this," he said simply. Eleanor's hands trembled at her sides. "I will never forget." Gerald stepped forward, tilting his head slightly. "You'll learn, Eleanor," he said, his voice softer now, as if he were speaking to a child who had yet to understand the rules of the world. "One day you'll thank me." Her body shook, rage bubbling beneath her skin. "I will hate you until the day I die." His lips barely twitched. "Hate is just love that has nowhere to go." The words cut through her like glass, and in that moment, Eleanor realized something. Her father had won. He had taken Isaiah. He would take her child, and she was powerless to stop it. The walls of her childhood home felt smaller, suffocating, closing in like a cage. She was no longer Eleanor Whitmore. She was just another girl, lost to the will of a man who held all the power. The Charleston boarding house smelled of rain and forgotten prayers. The walls were thin, the floors creaked with every movement, and the air was thick with the quiet suffering of women just like Eleanor. Girls sent away to hide their shame, to return home as if nothing had ever happened. She had been there for months, trapped in a routine that felt more like a sentence. The mornings were filled with whispers and the rustle of fabric as they washed their clothes in silence. The afternoons were spent staring out the dusty window, counting the days until the inevitable, and the nights, those were the worst. That was when the past clawed at her, when Isaiah's voice haunted her dreams, when she woke with her hand on her stomach, whispering to the life growing inside her. She had wanted to fight, she had wanted to run. But where? To what? Her father's reach was everywhere, and Isaiah was gone. Then, one cold morning, she felt the first contraction. The pain was sharp, tearing through her body, like a storm breaking against the shore. She cried out, but the matrons had done this before. They knew the script. "Shh, dear," one of them murmured, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. Just breathe. But how could she breathe when everything was being taken from her? The labor lasted hours, agonizing, endless hours, and then he was there, a son, her son. They placed him in her arms, and for the first time in months, the walls of her world faded away. He was warm, tiny, perfect. His skin was a deep brown, his eyes dark and searching. He was hers, a piece of Isaiah, a piece of love that had refused to die. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she traced his little fingers, committing every detail to memory. But then the door opened. Her father stood there, framed in the dim light, his expression cold, unyielding. "It's time," he said simply. She clutched the baby to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "No." Margaret Whitmore stepped forward, her voice softer, but no less final. "Eleanor, you know this must be done." "No!" she screamed this time, the rawness of it ripping from her throat. "You can't!" But they could, and they did. Strong hands pried her fingers away, lifted the baby from her arms. The wail that erupted from him was unbearable, splitting the air like a knife through flesh. She fought, thrashed against them, but she was weak. The pain, the exhaustion, it was too much. And then he was gone. The moment the door shut, something inside her shattered. She didn't cry. She didn't scream anymore. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of nothingness consume her. By the time she was strong enough to stand, by the time she could walk to the window, the world had already moved on. Her baby was gone. Her life, as she had known it, was over. Eleanor returned to Fairmont Hills, a different woman. The dresses, the pearls, the poised smile, those were the same. But she was hollow now, a ghost of herself. Her father never spoke of the child again, neither did her mother. The house was filled with polite conversation, lavish parties, and the unspoken rule that the past did not exist. She was expected to marry, of course, to find a suitable husband, as if love were just another transaction. Men came and went, none of them seeing beyond the mask she wore. And then she met Henry Carter. It was at a university gala, one of those events where old money and new ambition collided in hushed deals and tight handshakes. Henry stood out immediately, though not for the reasons people whispered about. He was black, a self-made man, a rising name in the world of finance, one of the few to cross the lines that men like Gerald Whitmore had drawn in stone. He carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that came from knowing he had carved his own way in a world that never made it easy. Eleanor had seen many men try to impress her, but Henry, he had nothing to prove. "You don't belong at these things," she had told him, swirling the champagne in her glass. He had smirked. "Neither do you." And just like that, the careful script she had been forced to follow unraveled. Henry was different. He didn't chase her like the others. He didn't try to fit into the mold her family expected. He challenged her, asked her things no one else dared. "Are you happy?" The question had hit her like a slap, because the truth was, she wasn't. For the first time in years, someone looked at her and saw beyond the carefully constructed facade, and she let him. Their love wasn't an easy one. Society had changed, but not enough. People stared, some whispered, others were more direct, spitting words meant to wound. Henry took it in stride. He had spent his whole life fighting battles Eleanor couldn't even begin to understand. And when she tried to shield him from her father's wrath, he simply shook his head. "I don't need your protection, Eleanor." And he didn't. Henry Carter didn't beg for approval. He built his own empire. By the time Gerald Whitmore realized his daughter wasn't going to change her mind, Henry was already too powerful to erase. So the Whitmore family did what they always did. They pretended. They smiled for wedding photos, shook hands at business dinners. They kept their comments just below a whisper, and Eleanor played along. But Henry saw it all. One night, after yet another strained dinner with her family, he found her on the balcony, staring out at the sprawling estate that had never really been hers. "You don't have to stay in their world," he had said, voice low, steady. She turned to him. "Then where do I go?" His hand found hers, warm, grounding. "Wherever you want." For the first time in a long time, she believed that was true. Eleanor built a life with Henry, a real life, one not dictated by her father's rules. They had success, wealth, a beautiful home. They had each other. But there was always something she never told him, something buried so deep inside her that she convinced herself it didn't matter anymore. She had left one man behind. She had lost one child. And no matter how much love she had now, no matter how much time passed, there was a wound that had never truly healed, a secret she had sworn she would never speak of again. The room smelled of lavender and aged wood, a scent that had lingered in the Whitmore Carter estate for decades. The rain drummed softly against the window, a steady rhythm that matched the shallow rise and fall of Eleanor's frail chest. The once grand chandelier above them flickered slightly, casting shadows along the walls, as if even the house itself was mourning what was about to be lost. Henry Carter sat beside the bed, his strong, calloused fingers wrapped around Eleanor's fragile hand. He had never seen her this weak, never seen her look this small, this breakable. For 50 years, she had been a force, graceful, poised, untouchable in the way only women of her upbringing were trained to be. But now, there was no hiding behind pearls and pressed dresses, no perfect smiles to mask the truth. She was dying, and Henry wasn't ready. He had spent his life building an empire, securing their place in a world that had never wanted to accept them. They had been through everything, together. Whispers at dinner parties, sideways glances in boardrooms, the subtle but ever-present reminder that their love had defied the world's expectations. But what he couldn't fight was time. Eleanor's breaths were uneven now, her body frail beneath the soft linen sheets, and still, she was holding something back. Henry could feel it. It wasn't just the weight of illness in the air, it was something else, something heavy. He had known her long enough to recognize when she was hiding something. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice low, steady. "What is it?" She blinked, slow and deliberate, before shifting her gaze to meet his. Her once bright blue eyes had dulled with age, but there was something behind them now, a flicker of something unresolved. She was afraid. He had never seen Eleanor Whitmore Carter afraid. "I have to tell you something," she whispered, her voice barely above the sound of the rain tapping against the window pane. Henry's grip tightened slightly. "Then tell me." She exhaled, her lips trembling. For a moment she looked away, as if searching the corners of the room for an escape, but there was none, not anymore. "I should have told you a long time ago," she said, her voice cracking. A strange unease settled in Henry's chest. "Eleanor, whatever it is." He hesitated, unsure if he wanted to hear what came next. "You can tell me." A tear slipped down her cheek, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a breath. Before us, I was in love with someone else." The words hit like a distant echo, a ripple in the stillness of the room. Henry frowned, but he didn't speak. He had never been the jealous type. He knew Eleanor had a past, just as he did. They had come into each other's lives as grown people, whole, but scarred in ways they never fully unpacked. This shouldn't have mattered, but something about the way she said it made his stomach turn. He waited. Eleanor swallowed hard. His name was Isaiah. Henry's breath hitched, barely noticeable, but she caught it. "He worked for my father," she continued, her voice unsteady. A stable hand. Henry's fingers twitched around hers. She inhaled shakily, her gaze locked onto his. "I loved him, Henry. And I—" Her throat closed around the words, as if they were knives she had carried for years. She exhaled, her voice barely a whisper. "I had a child with him." The world stopped. Henry's grip loosened, his chest tightened. "What?" Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, as if the weight of it was too much to bear. "My father found out," she continued, her voice raw, cracking under the pressure of words she had held inside for half a century. "He took the baby from me. He made sure I never saw him again." Henry felt the blood drain from his face. She had been hiding a child? Their entire marriage, the decades of love, of building a life together, she had been carrying this secret? He pulled back slightly, his mind racing, struggling to catch up. All these years, the moments when she had been distant, the nights when she had sat by the window, lost in thought, the times he had caught her looking at old photographs with a sadness she never explained. It had always been there. He just hadn't known what it was. Henry stood slowly, his hand slipping from hers. The floor beneath him felt unsteady. "You had a son?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Eleanor nodded, fresh tears slipping down her wrinkled cheeks. He stared at her, his wife, the woman he had shared a life with, and for the first time he realized there was a part of her he had never truly known. His voice was quieter now. "Where is he?" Eleanor's breath caught. She shook her head. "I don't know." Henry's jaw clenched. Her shoulders trembled. "I wanted to fight for him, but I was too scared. My father, he made it clear that if I disobeyed, Isaiah would pay the price. So I—" She swallowed hard, her voice barely a breath. "I let him go." Henry turned away, rubbing a hand down his face, trying to process the storm inside him. Somewhere out there, a son existed, his wife's son, a child lost to time, a child who had grown up without a mother, without knowing where he came from. Henry didn't speak for a long time. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall filling the silence between them. When he finally turned back to her, Eleanor's face was crumpled in regret. "I never stopped thinking about him," she whispered. "Not a single day." Henry exhaled slowly, his hands trembling at his sides. This changed everything. The past, the life they had built, it had all been standing on a foundation of something unfinished. And now, Henry was left with a choice. He could walk away from it, let the past stay buried with her, or he could find the truth, find him. The house had never felt this quiet. Henry Carter stood in the middle of the grand sitting room, staring at the framed wedding photo above the fireplace. It had been taken 50 years ago. Eleanor in her lace gown, her golden hair pinned perfectly, and him standing beside her in a sharp black suit. They had looked unstoppable. A love that had defied expectations, outlasted criticism, built something unshakable. Or so he had thought. The confession still rang in his ears. "I had a child with him. My father took him away from me. I never saw him again." Henry squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the words out of his head. But they wouldn't leave. Somewhere out there, a son existed. A child. Eleanor's child. A man now, grown and living a life built on a lie he never knew. Did he wonder? Did he ask about the mother who had disappeared before he could even form a memory of her? Or worse, had he stopped wondering at all? Henry sat down at the grand oak desk, staring at the mess of papers in front of him. Old documents, birth records, names of adoption agencies from over 50 years ago. He had spent the last 3 weeks buried in this search, barely sleeping, hardly eating. His children, his and Eleanor's children, had noticed the shift. "Dad, what are you doing?" His daughter, Margaret Carter, had asked one evening when she caught him with a pile of records spread across the dining table. Henry had only given a vague answer. How could he explain to them that the woman they had adored, their mother, had spent her life hiding another son from them? That somewhere out there they had a brother? How could he explain it to himself? A sharp knock at the front door pulled him from his thoughts. He walked to the entryway, pulling it open to find James Holloway, a private investigator he had hired, standing on the porch. The man was in his early 50s, tall and thin, with a face carved by years of uncovering painful truths. Henry's heart pounded. "Tell me you found something?" Holloway exhaled, adjusting the collar of his coat against the autumn wind. "I found something." Henry stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The door shut with a quiet click, locking them in the heavy silence of what was about to come. The investigator pulled out a folder, setting it on the coffee table. It took a while. A lot of records from that time are missing, destroyed, or more likely, hidden by people who had the power to do so. Henry's jaw tightened. Gerald Whitmore. That man's reach had extended further than even Henry had imagined. But, Holloway continued, I tracked down a lead. The home where Eleanor was sent handled adoptions quietly. Families paid for discretion, especially with cases like hers. He opened the folder, revealing an old yellowed document. Henry leaned forward, scanning the page. His breath caught in his throat. Infant, male, born July 2nd, 1972. Mother, Eleanor Whitmore. Father, unlisted. The handwriting was neat, clinical, as if the life it documented was nothing more than an item on a ledger. Henry's fingers trembled slightly as he read the next line. Adoptive parents, Samuel and Lorraine Matthews, Charleston, South Carolina. A name was listed at the bottom. David Matthews. Henry exhaled sharply. He looked up at Holloway, his voice unsteady. You found him? Holloway nodded. David Matthews, 51 years old, principal at a high school in a small town outside of Charleston, married, 2 kids. Henry ran a hand down his face, his mind racing. His son, Eleanor's son, had a life, a family, a career. He had a name. Henry closed the folder carefully, his hands still shaking. What now? Holloway asked, his voice softer than before. Henry didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the name on the page, feeling the weight of what it meant. For 50 years, this man had lived without knowing where he came from. And now, Henry had the power to change that. But should he? Would David Matthews even want to know? Would he be grateful to learn the truth? Or would it unravel everything he had ever believed about himself? And beyond that, what if he hated Eleanor for what she had done? What if, instead of healing, this truth only brought more pain? Henry Carter had spent his life making difficult decisions. Business, family, love. But this was something else entirely. Finally, he inhaled deeply, the decision settling inside him like a quiet storm. He had to see him, even if it was just from a distance. Even if David never knew his name, even if he never said a word, Henry had to look into the eyes of the son that had been lost. Because in the end, some truths were too heavy to be left buried. The drive to Charleston was long, the road stretching endlessly ahead, lined with towering oaks draped in Spanish moss. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the occasional hum of the tires against the pavement. Henry Carter gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles white, his mind tangled in thoughts he couldn't escape. He had spent days, weeks, debating whether to do this, whether to step into a stranger's life and rip open a past that had been buried for 50 years. David Matthews. The name felt foreign on his tongue, but the truth of it was undeniable. Eleanor's son. And now, sitting outside a modest brick house in a quiet Charleston neighborhood, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear, not the kind he had faced in boardrooms, not the kind that came with fighting for a place in a world that didn't always welcome him. This was different. This was the fear of changing a life forever. Through the windshield, he saw the front door swing open. A man stepped out, locking the door behind him. David. Henry felt his chest tighten. David Matthews was tall, built solidly like a man who had carried the weight of responsibility his entire life. His hair was short, streaked with just a hint of gray at the temples, his skin a deep, rich brown. And his face was unmistakable. Henry had never met Isaiah Walker, but he had seen pictures. And David? David had his father's eyes. Henry sat frozen as David walked down the driveway, completely unaware of the man watching him from the car parked across the street. He had a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, wearing the kind of neatly pressed shirt that only a school principal would wear. His expression was calm, focused, the kind of face that probably greeted students with patience but held the quiet authority of a man who had learned how to lead. Henry had never been the type to hesitate, but now his hands refused to move. How do you tell a man that the life he's known, the name he's carried, the family he's loved wasn't his from the start, that the woman who gave birth to him had wanted to fight for him but had been too afraid, that she had spent her entire life grieving the child she lost, only to die without ever seeing him again? Henry swallowed hard, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. David Matthews was his wife's son, but he was also a man with a family of his own, a wife, children, people who had built a life around him, never questioning whether he truly belonged to them. Would this truth be a gift or a wound? David walked toward a silver sedan, keys in hand. He was leaving. This was Henry's moment. He could step out, call his name, change everything. But before he could move, another voice broke the silence. "Dad, wait!" A young man, maybe 16, 17 years old, came running out of the house, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Henry inhaled sharply. David turned, smiling as the boy approached. "Hurry up, Elijah, or we're going to be late." Elijah, his grandson. The realization slammed into Henry so hard that he had to grip the steering wheel to steady himself. Eleanor had a grandson. Henry had been so focused on David that he hadn't even considered this. This wasn't just about a son. This was about an entire branch of family that had never known they belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. Henry watched as David ruffled his son's hair playfully before they both got into the car. For a brief second, before David pulled away, their eyes met. Henry's breath caught in his throat. David frowned slightly, just for a second, as if sensing something familiar. And then he was gone. The silver sedan disappeared down the street, leaving Henry sitting there, staring at the empty driveway, his heart hammering inside his chest. He had come to change David's life. But in that moment, he realized something else. David had already changed his. The old photograph felt fragile in David's hands, its edges worn, its surface faded with time. The image was simple: a young woman with delicate features, golden hair, and piercing blue eyes. There was something haunting about her expression, as if she were caught between sadness and longing, between duty and regret. His fingers traced the name written in elegant cursive on the back: Eleanor Whitmore. The name meant nothing to him, but the man who had handed him this photograph, the older, black man with graying hair and steady, knowing eyes, meant everything. Henry Carter. The name had carried weight when David first heard it, but not as much as the words that followed. "She was your mother." David exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his desk. His office at the school suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in, the framed degrees and photographs staring back at him like silent witnesses to a truth he had never asked for. For 51 years, He had been David Matthews, son of Samuel and Lorraine Matthews. He had been raised in a loving home, taught to value hard work, integrity, and family. His family. Now, with one conversation, one revelation, everything had shifted. Henry Carter sat across from him, calm but waiting for him to understand. David finally lifted his eyes, his voice a quiet storm. "You're telling me the people who raised me weren't my real parents?" Henry's face didn't change. "They were your parents, David, but Eleanor, she was your mother. She gave birth to you." David clenched his jaw, looking down at the photograph again. "And she just gave me away." A flicker of emotion crossed Henry's face, something between sadness and something deeper, understanding. "No," he said softly. "She didn't want to." David's chest tightened. "Then why did she?" Henry hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because she was afraid." David let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Afraid?" He shook his head, his grip tightening around the photograph. "That's real convenient." He could feel anger creeping in, an unfamiliar kind, the type that curled in the pit of his stomach like something waiting to erupt. 51 years. 51 years. No sign, no letters, no desperate attempts to find him. Just silence. Henry leaned forward, his voice steady but heavy with truth. "Her father forced her. He took you away before she even had a chance to hold on to you. She wasn't given a choice." David swallowed, his throat dry. It was hard to picture. He had never thought about where he had come from. He had never needed to. He had been loved. He had been enough. But now there was a woman, a mother, buried in the past, a mother who had lived her entire life carrying a secret, a mother who had died before she could tell him the truth herself. David took a deep breath, trying to push away the questions that screamed inside his head. "Why now?" he asked, his voice quieter. Henry met his gaze, unwavering. "Because she carried this pain her entire life. And now that she's gone, I couldn't let it die with her." David shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "And what do you expect me to do with this, Mr. Carter?" Henry sighed, rubbing his hands together slowly, as if considering the weight of the moment. "That's not for me to decide." Silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. David's mind raced, memories of his childhood clashing with this new reality. The Christmas mornings, the bedtime stories, the unwavering support of two people who had loved him without question. He thought of his own children, of Elijah. What would he say if someone walked in one day and told him his life was built on a lie? A sharp pain stabbed at his chest. "She's gone." The words barely left his lips. "I never got to ask her why." Henry nodded, his expression etched with a quiet grief. "I know." David looked at him, then really looked at him. This wasn't just about Eleanor. This was about the man in front of him, the man who had spent a lifetime loving a woman who had carried a hidden wound, the man who had chosen to find him, to bring him the truth, knowing it could break everything apart. David exhaled, pressing his fingertips against his temple. Everything felt too much, too big, too late. He stared at the photograph again, his mother's face staring back at him, caught in time. He didn't know whether to feel anger or grief, or maybe both. The coffee shop was quiet, tucked away on the edge of Charleston, where the air smelled like fresh rain and salt from the nearby coast. The hum of distant conversations and the occasional clink of cups filled the space. But to David Matthews, the world outside felt like a distant blur. He sat by the window, fingers loosely wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from him sat Henry Carter, The man who had unraveled 51 years of certainty with nothing more than a name, a photograph, and a truth David still wasn't sure he wanted. Days had passed since their first conversation, but David's mind hadn't found peace. The weight of it all pressed against his chest, making it impossible to sleep, to focus, to move forward without feeling like something was missing. He had spent his life believing his adoptive parents were his beginning. Now he had to reconcile the fact that there was a whole other world, another history, that had been stolen from him before he even had a chance to claim it. And Eleanor Whitmore, his mother, a woman he would never meet, a woman who had carried his absence like a wound for half a century. David exhaled sharply, dragging a hand over his face. "I don't know what you expect me to do with this, Mr. Carter." Henry studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he placed his cup down. "I don't expect anything, David. That's not why I came." David scoffed, shaking his head. "Then why did you? Why now? After all these years?" Henry leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "Because I made a promise to Eleanor." His voice was steady but heavy. "And because I know what it's like to live with regret." David clenched his jaw. "Regret?" Henry sighed, looking down for a moment before meeting his gaze again. "I spent my life loving a woman who never truly let go of her past. I saw it in the way she stared at the window on quiet nights, in the way she held on to guilt she never spoke about. She wanted to find you, David. He exhaled. "She was afraid. She didn't know if you'd want to be found." David's throat tightened. Want to be found. He had never felt lost before, never questioned where he belonged. But now he wasn't so sure. He glanced down at the small folder Henry had placed on the table. Inside were letters. Letters Eleanor had written but never sent. Letters filled with words she had never spoken. David had read them all, and each one had felt like a ghost whispering through time, pulling him into a past he had never lived but had always been a part of. "My sweet boy, I dream of you often. I wonder if you have your father's kindness, if you laugh the way I once did before the world taught me to be quiet. I wonder if you know, if you can feel somehow that I never stopped loving you. Would you hate me if you knew the truth? I hope, wherever you are loved." David swallowed hard, the words lingering in his chest like a wound that refused to heal. "I spent my whole life believing I had the perfect family," he murmured, his voice quieter now. "And now, I feel like I never even knew who I was." Henry nodded, his expression softening. "That's not something I can fix, David, but I can tell you this: your mother never stopped loving you, and that has to count for something." David looked away, staring out the window where the rain had begun to fall lightly against the glass. He thought about his own children, thought about what it would mean to be ripped away from them, to never see them again, to live with the knowledge that they were out there, but beyond his reach. And suddenly, he understood. Eleanor hadn't forgotten him. She hadn't moved on. She had been a prisoner to the choices that were made for her. His fingers tightened around the coffee cup, emotions swirling in his chest. He wasn't ready to forgive her, but for the first time, he wasn't sure he could hate her either. David turned back to Henry, his voice steadier now. "I don't know what to do with this." Henry gave him a small, knowing smile. "Then start with the truth. Let it sit with you. And when you're ready, maybe you and I can figure out where to go from here." David hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. It wasn't an answer, but it was a start. The house was warm, filled with the scent of old books and freshly brewed coffee. A soft fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Henry Carter sat in his favorite chair, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. His hands rested on his lap, fingers interlaced, his mind distant. It had been months since the truth had been spoken. Months since David Matthews had learned that his life had been written by hands he never knew. That the mother who had loved him from afar had died with a sorrow she never mended, and yet he had come back. The knock on the door had been quiet, uncertain. But when Henry opened it, there David stood, tall, hesitant, carrying the weight of too many emotions to name. Now, he sat across from Henry, staring into the fire, fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee, as if the warmth might steady him. Neither of them had spoken for a while, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding. David exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I've been thinking about her." Henry nodded. "I know." David's thumb brushed absently over the side of his mug. "I spent so much time feeling angry. Angry at her for not coming for me. Angry at myself for not knowing." He let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I thought knowing the truth would make it easier. That maybe it would give me, I don't know, closure." Henry waited. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But it doesn't. It just leaves me with more questions, more things I can never ask her." Henry's heart clenched at the words. He understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. "There are things we never get answers to," Henry said, his voice even. "I spent 50 years with your mother, and I still didn't know everything inside her heart." David's eyes flickered to Henry, searching. "Do you regret it?" The question hit deeper than Henry expected. He thought of Eleanor, the girl who had once dreamed of running away under the magnolia trees, the woman who had carried a secret for half a century, the wife who had loved him despite the fractures in her soul. And now, looking at her son, Henry felt something shift inside him. "I regret that she suffered alone," Henry admitted. "I regret that she never let me share that weight with her." He looked at David, his gaze steady. "But I don't regret loving her. Not for a second." David swallowed, nodding slowly. He turned, his gaze back to the fire, lost in thought. A quiet moment passed before Henry spoke again. "She wanted you to be happy," he said softly. That was the one thing she said over and over in her letters. David's jaw tightened, and he nodded once. "I think she would have been a good mother." Henry smiled, a deep sadness settling in his chest. "She would have been the best." The silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't filled with grief or regret. It was filled with something new, possibility. David took a slow breath. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted. Henry gave a small chuckle. "Neither do I." David finally turned to him fully, studying the man who had loved his mother, the man who had taken it upon himself to bring him the truth, even knowing how much it might hurt. "I have kids," David said finally. "They're good kids, smart, kind." Henry smiled. "I don't doubt that." David hesitated, then met his eyes. "Would you like to meet them?" Something caught in Henry's throat, an emotion he hadn't expected. He straightened slightly, his voice quieter than before. "I'd like that very much." David nodded once, as if sealing something unspoken between them. The past would never change. The wounds would never fully disappear. But sitting there, in the warmth of the fire, two men from different worlds, bound by the same woman, by the same love, by the same pain, found something they never thought they'd have. A beginning, Some secrets are buried, but the truth always finds its way to the surface. Now take a moment and ask yourself, how much do you really know about the people you love? What if there was something left unsaid, something that could change everything? Would you want to know, or would you rather live in the comfort of not knowing? This story isn't just about one man's past, it's about all of us. The choices we make, the truths we hide, the regrets we carry. It makes you wonder, how many people around you are holding on to a secret they're too afraid to share? So tell me, if you had the chance to uncover a truth that could change your life forever, would you take it? Or are some things better left in the dark? Let's talk about it in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. And if this story made you feel something, if it opened your mind to new perspectives, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story that will challenge the way you see the world. Because the truth, it's always closer than we think.